Tonight, PBL is proud to present a light-hearted musical essay by Glenn Gould, which he entitles How Mozart Became a Bad Composer.
That example came from Mozart's Piano Concerto in C minor, one of the last works he produced in that form, one of only two in a minor key, and perhaps for both those program noteworthy reasons, a work that's had a rather better press than it deserves, I think. Despite its gently swooning melodies, its meticulously balanced cadences, despite its stable and architecturally unexceptionable form, I'm going to submit it as a good example of why I think Mozart, especially in his later years, was not a very good composer. But the italics are squarely on that word composer because Mozart was unquestionably a very great musician, and I'm not being coy when I try to foster that distinction. By the evidence of his contemporaries, he was a superlative performer and an improviser of note. By the evidence of our own eyes and ears, a resourceful craftsman in the theater, and in all the familiar musical forms of his day, an exhilaratingly dependable artist who could knock out a divertimento the way an accounts executive dispatches an inter-office memo. But in a way, that's his problem. Too many of his works sound like inter-office memos. They're pertinent, they're often blessed with an engaging sense of humor, they sometimes provide a concise resume of the main points their author wants to make, but like inter-office memos, they can jump from point to point, or, on the other hand, dwell at unconscionable length upon a particular point, which details the executive's pet peeve, a point not necessarily germane to the corporate interest. And in that example, I think Mozart was dictating just such a memo. He held that series of rather undistinctive and virtually indistinguishable E-flat major themes together with listless scale runs and predictable chord changes. And guess what came after that? Like an executive holding forth upon the ramifications of a subject that no one in the front office was much concerned with anyway. Yeah, well, Harry, as I see it, JB's got this thing about replacing the water cooler. Let's just file it and forget it. But before we do that, let's hear some more of this famous Mozart concerto, this time played by my colleague, the distinguished British pedagogue, Sir Humphrey Price Davies, whose artistry, needless to say, I greatly admire, but whose views I couldn't agree with less.
thank you. You're very kind, thank you. How well I remember Sir Joshua saying during my last year at the Academy, retain the C minor, start it up as you would the Ninth or Gerontius, all the great pronouncements, and it will be a blessing in your later years.
Some people claim they find in the late works a maturity of outlook which they deny to the early concertos.
30 years he'd waited to produce that piece, Sir Joshua would say. He'd stored up his impressions and experience of life, and you must do the same, whatever the cost.
They claim that this maturity helped Mozart come to terms with the techniques he'd used in his previous 490 works.
Sir Joshua was right, of course. It's not an easy work to come to terms with. Who can say why Mozart settles down for such a spell in E-flat major, eh? Who can say? But he does, and what a grand thing it is not to modulate, to remain secure.
But to me, it seems like a haven for some wistful and likable themes which would have been far better off within the stricter regime of the concertos or symphonies that he composed a few years earlier.
One can't ignore work like that, can't turn one's back on such a piece.
It seems to me that by the time Mozart wrote that concerto, he'd already passed his peak as a composer, that the symphonies and sonatas he composed a decade earlier are structurally more coherent, texturally more consistent than the work of his later years. There's nothing wrong with that example. At least one can't prove a case against it academically, but neither is it nearly as taut and compelling and concise as it could be. For some reason, despite all his experience and talent and facility, Mozart was content to set down in that piece, that purported late masterpiece, an appalling collection of clichés. Let's try to find out why. It's very difficult to define that word cliché and not get trapped by it. But I guess one definition would be a phrase or an idea which, through repeated use, has lost its point of view. Many of the sequential progressions which Mozart worked to death in that concerto would have seemed one generation earlier discriminating comments on the precarious evolution of classical tonality. But when heard in a late work like that Mozart's C minor concerto, they seem unenterprising somehow and disdainful of the real problems posed by the concerto form. The sequence is only one kind of Mozart cliché, but along with the walking bass, the running treble, and the curtsying cadence, they all help to make Mozart perhaps the easiest to imitate of the great composers. And of all these clichés, the sequence is the easiest by far to treat of statistically. The sequence is not really a very difficult item to define. It's a musical thought or an idea which is repeated ad infinitum in various registers of the keyboard, and without any of the human and humane changes that a composer would normally bring to bear on it. Here's one sequence that Mozart uses in that concerto. So I'm going to override all subjective value judgments and reduce 1 minute's worth of that piece, that Mozart C minor concerto, to statistics. By doing that, I can prove, I think, that for almost 90% of the bars which followed the first of those E-flat major themes, 90% of the area after that, for 31 of 35 bars to be exact, Mozart ruthlessly exploited the sequence, his favorite time consumer. Was the harmonic substance of the area immediately after that subject, and for 10 bars he did absolutely nothing except cover up in the most delinquent way with scales and arpeggios precisely those rather inane chords. All there was to that. And then having done that, he introduces another sort of sequence to it, just as arbitrary as the one we've just heard, the falling fifth sequence, but every bit as boring. And it's back to our falling fifths routine again. Progression is simply dropping by a fifth, the fifth from the bar preceding it. There are no exceptions, no elaborations, no fanciful breakings of the pattern, only the same relentless quest for an equable, unflappable, and I'm afraid inevitably undistinguished harmony. Well, then Mozart does break the pattern for just a moment, but only to offer us another kind of sequence, slightly more animated this time, but every bit as arbitrary. Then it's back to the falling fifths routine once again. And so it goes. And all that was non-sequential in those whole 35 bars of music could be summed up in this one pathetic fragment. Nothing more. And this is by no means an isolated example. It's typical, sadly, of that jaded, world-weary approach which beset Mozart in his later years. And one may very well ask what happened. Why were those prodigious gifts which made Mozart as a young man the toast of Europe reduced in the end to skillful self-parody?